Most people mistake silence for stagnation. They see a man who moves without announcing himself, who builds without witnesses, who measures his progress by what gets done rather than by who noticed, and they read absence as lack. They assume that because he is not surrounded, he must be struggling. They confuse solitude with limitation. That misreading is not a minor error in perception. It is a fundamental failure to understand what pressure actually produces in certain kinds of people. There is a specific type of formation that only happens when no one is coming. Not as a metaphor, not as a motivational premise, but as a daily operational fact. When the circumstances strip away the reasonable expectation of assistance, something in the system recalibrates. The man stops waiting for conditions to improve and begins working within conditions as they are. He stops calculating what he could do with more and starts extracting the maximum from what exists. That shift is not a coping mechanism. It is a structural change in how the mind relates to reality. It does not reverse when conditions eventually improve. It becomes the baseline. What is built during that period is not just output. It is architecture. The discipline that forms when no one is watching operates at a different density than discipline that develops under supervision, encouragement, or the social friction of accountability to others. The former is self-sustaining by design because it had to be. It was never supported by external approval. It was never interrupted by external doubt. It runs on an internal engine that was assembled precisely because no external engine was available. That engine does not stall when praise disappears, because it was never fueled by praise to begin with. This is what most observers miss when they encounter the man who built everything without support. They see the result and attribute it to luck, stubbornness, or some inherited advantage they have not identified yet. They do not see the years of operating under conditions that would have dismantled most people entirely. Not because those people were weak in some absolute sense, but because they were never required to function without the scaffolding. The scaffolding was always there. The social reinforcement, the financial cushion, the network of quiet assistance, the ambient assumption that someone would help if things got bad enough. Remove all of that, and a very different psychology emerges. Not better in a moral sense, different in a structural one. More self-contained, more precise, less dependent on external validation to sustain momentum. The man who passed through that formation carries something that is genuinely difficult to explain to someone who has not experienced it. Not because it is mystical, but because it is experiential in the most literal sense. He has already confronted the version of failure that most people avoid by never fully committing. He has already operated in the space where there was no fallback. That confrontation changes the calculation. Not every decision, but the deep ones. The ones that involve risk, exposure, uncertainty, and the real possibility of collapse. He has already run that scenario. He already knows what it feels like to be in it without assistance. And he knows, with the specificity of lived experience rather than theoretical confidence, that he can continue functioning inside it. That knowledge does not make him fearless. It makes him accurate. Here is where the misunderstanding compounds. Because the surface observation, that this man operates alone, prefers solitude, and does not build his work around social approval, often leads to the conclusion that he is finished. That the solitude is the ceiling, that isolation is the permanent condition rather than a phase of a longer process. The assumption is that because he did not need people to build the foundation, He will remain in that solitary mode indefinitely. That is a misreading of what actually happened. The man who built alone did not avoid collaboration because he lacked the capacity for it. He avoided it because the quality of available collaboration at that stage would have been a liability rather than an asset. Not every alliance strengthens a structure. Some distribute control without distributing capability. Some introduce dependency without introducing value. The loner recognized this, not always consciously, but functionally, and he protected the integrity of what he was building by keeping its development internal until the foundation was solid enough to bear external weight without being distorted by it. That is not isolation as a permanent state. That is sequencing. The transition happens when the foundation is complete, not when it feels complete, which is a subjective and unreliable signal, but when the structure can sustain external pressure without losing its internal logic. When the man can engage with the world from a position of sufficiency rather than scarcity, the nature of his relationships changes entirely. He is no longer selecting connections based on who might help him survive. He is selecting them based on who can operate at the level he has already reached. That is a fundamentally different filter. It produces fundamentally different alliances. What emerges from that selection process is not dependence under a different name. It is amplification. Two systems with genuine internal integrity, operating in alignment, do not produce the sum of their individual capacities. They produce something beyond that, not because of enthusiasm or synergy as a concept, but because the absence of compensatory dynamics frees both parties to focus entirely on the work. There is no managing of fragility. There is no navigating around unspoken insecurities. There is no structural imbalance that quietly drains one party to sustain the other. The strength is already present on both sides. The collaboration adds direction to that strength rather than providing the strength itself. This is the version of the loner that the original observation was always pointing toward, even if it did not say so explicitly. Never underestimate a man who built everything with zero support, not only because of what he survived, but because of what he became in the process of surviving it. The resilience is real. The self-sufficiency is real. But those are not the ceiling. They are the qualification. They are what makes him capable, eventually, of choosing rather than needing, of building with others, not from a position of lack, but from a position of deliberate selection. That distinction is the entirety of the difference between someone who formed alliances because they had no other option and someone who forms them because they have earned the right to be selective about who they allow into the work. The man who was never underestimated deserved the underestimation he received, not as a judgment of his character, but as an accurate read of his circumstances. He had nothing. He had no network, no capital, no institutional backing, no safety net visible enough to make him legible as a serious player. The people who dismissed him were not entirely wrong about the conditions. They were entirely wrong about what those conditions would produce in him. What they failed to account for was that absence of support does not uniformly break people. In some, it consolidates them. It compresses everything unnecessary and leaves only what is load-bearing. And what remains, after that compression, is not a man who needs to be believed in. It is a man who has already decided what he is going to build and is simply waiting for the right moment to let the result speak for itself. That moment always arrives, and when it does, the underestimation does not require correction. It corrects itself.